Sometimes the hardest moments in life come when we least expect them, when we think we've already survived the worst. Harold Greyson was 80 years old when a simple ride home turned into a nightmare that would test everything he had left. A transport van dropped him at the wrong spot during a deadly blizzard and drove away, leaving him alone in the wilderness with no phone and nothing to protect him from the cold. The snow kept falling. His strength kept fading. Then he found an old shelter in the mountains, but he wasn't alone out there. What happened next changed everything people thought they knew about survival in the wild. Why did the wolves stay with him through the storm? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Harold Greyson had learned long ago that life doesn't follow the script you write for it. At 80 years old, he'd survived more than his share of rewrites, some brutal, some beautiful, all of them necessary. The modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street in Pine Ridge, Montana, had been his home for 15 years now, ever since he'd left the city and its memories behind. The wood-paneled walls held photographs spanning decades. A young couple on their wedding day, a little girl with pigtails holding a fishing rod, family gatherings around tables laden with food and laughter. The most prominent photo sat on the mantel, Violet in her garden, sunlight catching the silver in her hair, that gentle smile that had first captured his heart 56 years ago. She'd been gone 35 years now, taken by cancer before she could see their daughter Claire grow into the remarkable woman she'd become. Harold still talked to that photograph most mornings, updating Violet on the small details of his days as if she were just in the next room. "Claire's worried about me again," he'd told the photo that morning, adjusting his flannel shirt collar in the hallway mirror. "Says, I need to get this checkup. You know how she gets." The house smelled of coffee and sawdust, a combination that defined Harold's retirement years. His woodworking shop in the garage had become his sanctuary, where he crafted small items, cutting boards, picture frames, toys for his grandson Caleb. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, still remembered how to coax beauty from rough timber. The work kept him connected to something tangible, something he could shape and control when so much of life remained stubbornly beyond his influence. Raising Claire alone had been the hardest thing he'd ever done. After Violet died, Harold had been 45 with a 10-year-old daughter who just lost her mother. He'd worked 2 jobs, construction during the day, security at night to keep them afloat. There'd been no handbook for single fatherhood in 1990, no support groups in their small town, just Harold and Claire figuring it out together through tears and burnt dinners and homework sessions at midnight. But they'd made it. Claire had graduated valedictorian, earned her teaching degree, married a good man named Philip, and given Harold the greatest gift of his later years, Caleb, now 10 years old and full of the same curiosity that had defined his mother at that age. They lived in Seattle now, a 12-hour drive that felt longer with each passing year. Video calls helped, but Harold missed the weight of his grandson in his lap, the sound of Claire's laughter filling the house. Pine Ridge suited Harold. The town of 3,000 souls moved at a pace that matched his own these days. Tuesday mornings meant coffee at Francis's Diner on Main Street, where the owner kept his usual booth available and knew his order by heart. Black coffee, wheat toast, 2 eggs over easy. The other regulars had become something like family. George Kimball from next door, who helped with yard work. Harold could no longer manage alone. Sheriff Preston Talbot, who stopped by to check on the town's older residents. Young couples with children who reminded Harold of the life he'd once lived. "You're looking thoughtful this morning, Harold," Francis had said the previous Tuesday, refilling his cup. Her apron bore 30 years of coffee stains and memories. "Something on your mind?" "Just thinking about how fast it all goes," Harold had replied, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Feels like yesterday I was Claire's age, and now I'm the old man in the corner booth." Francis had patted his shoulder with the familiarity of long friendship. "Old is a state of mind, Harold. You've got more life in you than men half your age." He'd appreciated the sentiment, even if his body disagreed more often lately. The arthritis in his knees made stairs a challenge. His hearing had faded enough that he missed the higher notes of birdsong. The doctor in Whitefish wanted to check his heart, some irregular rhythm that probably meant nothing but required monitoring at his age. Claire had insisted on arranging everything, worried that he'd put it off indefinitely if left to his own devices. She wasn't wrong. Harold had developed a practiced avoidance of medical appointments, a stubborn independence that Violet would have scolded him for. But Claire had inherited her mother's persistence along with her green eyes, and she'd booked the transport service before Harold could object. A van would pick him up Tuesday morning, drive him the 75 miles to Whitefish for his appointment, and have him home by dinner. Simple, efficient, nothing to worry about. "I don't need a babysitter," Harold had protested during their Sunday video call, Caleb's face appearing over Claire's shoulder to make silly faces at the camera. "It's not babysitting, Dad. It's transportation. The roads can be tricky this time of year, and I'll feel better knowing someone else is driving." Claire's expression had softened. "Please. For me?" Harold had relented, as he always did when Claire asked. The guilt she carried for living so far away was something he wished he could lift from her shoulders. He'd chosen Pine Ridge, chosen the distance that gave him independence while she built her own life. But daughters worry, especially only daughters who'd already lost one parent too soon. Monday evening, Harold had prepared for the trip with the methodical care of someone who'd spent decades planning for contingencies. He'd laid out his good shirt, the one without paint stains or frayed cuffs. His wallet held his insurance card, driver's license, and the crumpled receipt from Francis's diner that he'd kept meaning to throw away. Tucked behind the cards was Violet's silver locket, tarnished with age but precious beyond measure. He'd carried it every day since her funeral, a talisman against loneliness. The weather forecast had mentioned snow, nothing unusual for Montana in late November, but the predictions seemed manageable. A few inches overnight, clearing by afternoon. Harold had survived 70 Montana winters. This would be number 71. He checked the windows, left a light on for when he returned, and settled into his recliner with a book about wolves he'd borrowed from the library. The irony wouldn't strike him until much later. Harold had always respected wolves, ever since his younger days working summers with the Forest Service. He'd been 23, newly married to Violet, and eager to prove himself in the wilderness. The old rangers had taught him to read animal signs, to understand the language of the forest, to recognize that humans were visitors in a world that belonged to creatures far older than civilization. He'd seen his first wolf pack that summer, a family moving through dawn mist like ghosts, purposeful and dignified. "They're not the villains people make them out to be," his supervisor had said. "They're just trying to survive, same as us. Show them respect, keep your distance, and they'll do the same." Harold had carried that lesson through the decades, even as he'd moved away from the wilderness into the rhythms of suburban fatherhood and eventually small-town retirement. But something about wolves had stayed with him, their loyalty to pack, their careful stewardship of territory, the way they moved through the world with ancient wisdom. Tuesday morning arrived with the grey light of impending snow. Harold dressed carefully, double-checked his wallet, and stood before Violet's photograph one more time. "Just a checkup," he told her. "I'll be home before you know it." If he'd known what the day would bring, he might have said something different. Something about love, about gratitude, about not taking a single moment for granted. But Harold Greyson, at 80 years old, still believed he had time for all the words he'd left unspoken. The transport van arrived at 9 o'clock sharp. The driver was young, maybe 25, with headphones dangling around his neck and eyes that barely met Harold's as he opened the van's side door. His name tag read Kyle in faded letters, and he wore the distracted expression of someone whose mind was already elsewhere. "Mr. Greyson?" Kyle asked, glancing at his phone screen. "That's me." Harold climbed into the van with careful movements, his knees protesting the high step. The interior smelled of artificial pine and stale coffee. Appreciate you making the drive. No problem. Whitefish Medical Center, right? Kyle was already pulling away from the curb, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching for his phone mounted on the dashboard. That's right. Appointment at 11. The first 20 miles passed in comfortable silence. Harold watched the familiar landscape roll by, stands of pine giving way to open meadows, the mountains rising in the distance like ancient sentinels. Snow had begun falling, light flakes that swirled in the wind but hadn't yet accumulated. The weather felt manageable, the kind of November snow that Montana residents barely noticed. Kyle's phone chimed repeatedly. Harold noticed the young man glancing down at messages, his attention splitting between the road and the glowing screen. It made Harold uneasy, but he said nothing. Young people lived attached to their devices these days. Claire was always scolding Caleb about screen time. "Weather's supposed to get worse," Harold offered, making conversation. "Forecast said heavy snow by afternoon." "Yeah, should be fine though. I'll have you there in plenty of time." Kyle's thumb moved across his phone screen. "GPS says we're making good time." That was when Harold noticed the navigation display recalculating, the blue line shifting on the digital map. Kyle frowned at it, tapped the screen, then shrugged. "Weird. Signal must be glitchy up here." The snow intensified as they climbed into higher elevations. What had been light flurries became steady snowfall, reducing visibility with each passing mile. The wind picked up, buffeting the van and creating whiteout conditions that forced Kyle to slow down. Harold could see the young man's knuckles whitening on the steering wheel, tension replacing his earlier casual demeanor. "Maybe we should pull over," Harold suggested. "No, it's fine, just a squall, it'll pass." But Kyle's voice carried uncertainty now. The GPS spoke with robotic authority. "In 0.5 miles, turn right." Kyle followed the instruction. Turning onto what appeared to be a smaller road, Harold felt the first stirrings of concern. This didn't look like the main highway to Whitefish. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to what might have been a service road beneath the accumulating snow. "Son, are you sure this is right?" Harold leaned forward, peering through the windshield at the deteriorating road conditions. "GPS says it's a shortcut." Kyle's confidence was evaporating. "Saves 15 minutes. But the road was disappearing beneath them. Snow fell so thick now that Harold could barely see 10 feet ahead. The van crawled forward. Kyle hunched over the wheel, his earlier bravado replaced by obvious fear. They passed no other vehicles, saw no signs of civilization, only endless white and the dark shapes of trees pressing in from both sides. "Turn around," Harold said firmly. "This isn't safe." Kyle tried. He attempted a 3-point turn on the narrow road, but the van's tires spun uselessly in the deepening snow. They were stuck, the engine revving helplessly as Kyle's panic mounted. He yanked the wheel, pressed the accelerator harder, achieving nothing but digging them deeper. "Stop," Harold commanded. "You're making it worse." Kyle sat back, breathing hard, face pale. He grabbed his phone, no signal. Tried again, nothing. "I can't, there's no reception." "How is there no reception?" "We're in the mountains, in a storm. Signals don't reach everywhere." Harold kept his voice calm, though his own concern was growing. "What's our exact location?" Kyle's hands shook as he checked the GPS. The screen showed them as a blue dot surrounded by green wilderness, miles from the marked highway. "I don't know. The GPS just said to turn here." I followed the directions. Wrong directions, apparently. Harold pulled out his own phone. The old flip model Claire had bought him for emergencies. No signal here either. The screen showed one bar, then none, flickering uselessly. They sat for 10 minutes while Kyle tried to call for help, tried to restart the GPS, tried everything his panicked mind could conjure. The snow continued falling, already obscuring the van's windows, piling on the hood in drifts. The temperature inside the vehicle dropped steadily despite the running engine. "Okay," Kyle said finally, his voice cracking slightly. "Okay. I'm going to walk back to the main road. It can't be more than a few miles. I'll flag down help and come back for you." "That's not a good idea," Harold said. "We should stay with the vehicle. Someone will come looking when we don't show up." "I can't just sit here." Kyle was already reaching for the door handle. "You stay, keep warm. I'll be back in an hour, 2 tops. Kyle, listen to me." But the young man was already out, the door slamming behind him. Harold watched through the snow-covered window as Kyle's figure disappeared into the white wall of the storm, swallowed within seconds. The rear door was still open, snow blowing inside, and Harold realized with sinking certainty that Kyle had left the keys in the ignition. He should have argued more, should have physically stopped the boy. But at 80, Harold's authority carried less weight than it once had, and Kyle's panic had overridden common sense. Harold climbed out to close the door Kyle had left open. The cold struck him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. He'd worn a coat, but not the heavy winter gear this weather demanded. The wind howled through the trees, driving snow into his face with stinging force. He reached for the door handle, and his foot slipped on ice hidden beneath the snow. Harold fell hard, his hip striking the frozen ground, pain shooting through his body. His phone flew from his hand, skittering across the ice, before coming to rest several feet away. He crawled toward it, fingers already numb, and watched in dismay as the screen shattered against a rock. Harold pulled himself upright, using the van's bumper, every joint protesting. He managed to close the door, then made his way around to the driver's side. The keys were there, dangling from the ignition. He could start the engine, use the heat, but he was 80 years old and hadn't driven in conditions like this in years. Even if he could free the van from the snow, he had no idea which direction to go. The smart choice was to stay here, wait for rescue. Except Kyle had mentioned the GPS malfunction, which meant no one knew their real location. Claire expected him home by dinner. When he didn't call, she'd worry, but it might be tomorrow before anyone realized something was seriously wrong. The transport company thought they'd dropped him at the medical center. There'd be confusion, delays, precious time lost, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. Harold looked around, trying to orient himself. Through breaks in the snowfall, he could see the dark line of a tree ridge rising to his left. Where there were ridges, there might be shelter, rock overhangs, hunters' cabins, something. The alternative was sitting in this van as the cold slowly worked its way inside, as the fuel eventually ran out, as night fell and temperatures dropped further. He'd spent enough time in wilderness to know the statistics. Hypothermia could kill in hours under these conditions. An 80-year-old man, alone in a stranded vehicle, was a tragedy waiting to happen. Harold made his decision. He'd walk toward the ridge, look for shelter, stay mobile and warm. It was risky, but staying felt riskier. He took a last look at the van, at the keys hanging uselessly, and began trudging through knee-deep snow toward the tree line. His legs ached within minutes. The cold penetrated his coat, his gloves, his very bones. But he pushed forward, one step at a time, because stopping meant dying, and Harold Greyson wasn't ready to stop yet. He'd walked perhaps a quarter mile when he saw them, the tracks in the snow. Fresh tracks, multiple sets, too large for dogs. Harold's heart stuttered in his chest as recognition dawned. Wolves! Harold stood motionless in the snow, staring at the tracks that crossed his path. They were unmistakable, the four-toed prints with claw marks extending beyond the pad, each impression nearly as large as his palm. Multiple animals moving in a line, their trail disappearing into the grey-white haze ahead. The tracks were fresh, no more than an hour old, the edges still sharp before the falling snow could soften them. His first instinct was fear. Wolves were predators, and he was alone, weakened, vulnerable. But Harold forced himself to breathe slowly, to remember what he'd learned decades ago in these same mountains. Wolves avoided humans when possible. They hunted elk and deer, not elderly men stumbling through blizzards. The danger came from surprising them, from appearing threatening, from behaving like prey. He needed shelter more than he needed to worry about wolves. The cold was the immediate threat. He could feel it seeping through his coat, his fingers already growing stiff inside his gloves. Harold continued forward, following the tree line upward, his eyes scanning for any break in the landscape that might offer protection. The slope grew steeper. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart hammering against his ribs. Twice he had to stop and lean against trees, waiting for the dizziness to pass. The world had become nothing but white and grey, all landmarks erased by the storm. He could be walking in circles for all he knew, using precious energy to achieve nothing. Then, through a break in the snowfall, he saw it, a dark shape against the mountainside, roughly 100 yards ahead. It looked man-made, angular in a way that natural rock formations weren't. Harold pushed toward it with renewed determination, each step an act of will. The structure was an old ranger station, weathered but intact, built partially into the hillside with logs that had aged to silver grey. A stone chimney rose from the roof, and a rickety wooden ladder led to an upper entrance. The main door was buried beneath a drift that must have accumulated over years of abandonment. The building looked like it hadn't been occupied in decades, but it was shelter, and shelter meant survival. Harold approached the ladder with trepidation. The rungs were slick with ice and snow, and his hands could barely grip them. But the alternative was freezing to death in the open. He tested the first rung it held. The second creaked ominously but supported his weight. Slowly, painfully, Harold climbed, his arthritic knees screaming protest with each movement. The upper door was unlocked, swinging open with a shriek of rusted hinges. Harold tumbled inside and lay on the floor for several minutes, simply breathing, grateful to be out of the wind. His body shook uncontrollably, the first stages of hypothermia setting in. When he could move again, Harold surveyed his sanctuary. The single room was perhaps 15 feet square, spartanly furnished, but remarkably intact. A cast-iron wood stove occupied one corner, its pipe extending through the roof. Emergency blankets were folded on a narrow cot. A shelf held various supplies, rope, a first aid kit, boxes of matches in waterproof containers, and, most valuable of all, a stack of split firewood against the far wall. Harold's hands trembled as he opened the stove door. Inside, someone long ago had laid kindling, ready for the next emergency. He found matches, struck one with numb fingers. It took 4 tries before he could keep his hand steady enough. The kindling caught, and Harold carefully fed it larger pieces, nursing the flame with the patience of someone who understood that rushing meant failure. As warmth began radiating from the stove, Harold noticed a small logbook on the shelf. He picked it up, the cover water-damaged, but legible. Ranger Station 7 log and emergency protocols. The last entry was dated the 15th of March, 1987. Harold opened it carefully. The pages contained observations about weather, wildlife, maintenance notes, all written in a precise hand. The name at the top of each entry read, Ranger Superintendent Cassidy. Harold flipped through, reading passages that spoke to lonely weeks maintaining this remote outpost. The daily routines of someone who'd chosen solitude over civilization. One entry caught his attention. The 3rd of February 1987 found 2 wolves near station, male and female, both injured. Male has infected paw, female shows signs of malnutrition. Against better judgment, provided food scraps from supplies. They're wary but not aggressive. Will monitor situation. Harold turned pages, finding more entries. February 10, wolves, still nearby. Males paw healing. They've begun howling at dawn, beautiful and haunting. Feel less alone, knowing they're out there. February 24. Named them despite knowing I shouldn't. He's Ranger, she's Scout. They watch the station from the tree line. Sometimes I think they're guarding me as much as I'm observing them. March 8. Released back into wild today. Healthy, strong, ready to rejoin their world. They lingered near the station for an hour before leaving. Scout looked back once. I felt the weight of that gaze, the intelligence behind it. Wolves remember. They understand kindness. I hope their pack will carry that forward. The entries ended there. No explanation for why Cassidy had left or what happened to this station. But Harold felt a strange kinship with this person he'd never met. Someone else who'd found themselves alone in these mountains, who'd connected with wolves in ways that defied easy explanation. He looked around the shelter with new appreciation. Cassidy had left it stocked, maintained, ready for the next soul who might stumble through that door desperate and cold. The firewood was carefully stacked, the matches sealed against moisture, the blankets folded with military precision. This place was meant to save lives. Harold moved to the window, a small frame covered with oiled canvas that still somehow kept out most of the wind. He pulled it aside and looked out at the storm. The snow fell heavier now, visibility reduced to mere yards. He'd made it inside just in time. Then he saw movement in the white, a shape, grey and massive, moving between the trees. Harold's breath caught. The shape resolved into a wolf, larger than he'd imagined they could be, its coat the colour of smoke and shadow. It was perhaps 50 feet from the station, stationary, watching. A second wolf appeared beside the first, smaller, its movements graceful despite the deep snow. They didn't approach closer, but they didn't leave either. They simply stood there, two sentinels in the storm, their attention fixed on the shelter. Harold remembered Cassidy's words, "Wolves remember." Could these be descendants of the pair Cassidy had helped? Was that even possible? Wolves didn't live 35 years, but packs passed down territories, behaviors, knowledge. He'd read about it in that library book, Generational Learning, the wisdom of the pack encoded not in genes but in teaching, in example, in the careful training of young by old. The wolves remained visible for another minute, then faded back into the trees like ghosts. But Harold could still see their tracks in the fresh snow, circling the shelter's perimeter. They were close. They were watching. He should have been terrified. Instead, he felt something stranger, not quite comfort, but a sense that he wasn't entirely alone. That whatever happened over the next hours or days, he was in a place where men and wolves had once found understanding. Harold pulled Violet's locket from his pocket and opened it. Her face looked back at him, forever young, forever smiling. "Well," he said aloud, his voice rough in the empty room, "this isn't how I planned to spend Tuesday." The stove crackled, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the storm raged on, and somewhere in those trees, wolves were pacing, waiting, watching over a shelter that had once been a sanctuary for their kind. Harold wrapped himself in an emergency blanket and settled near the stove, conserving his energy. He had fire, he had shelter, he had hope. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight he would survive. He'd survived worse before. Harold woke to silence. The kind of silence that only comes after a storm has exhausted itself, when even the wind pauses to catch its breath. Grey dawn light filtered through the canvas-covered window, and for a disorienting moment he didn't remember where he was. Then his body reminded him every joint ached, his hip throbbed where he'd fallen, and his toes felt distant and numb inside his boots. He sat up carefully, the emergency blanket crackling around him. The fire in the stove had died to ash overnight. Harold's breath misted in the frigid air as he assessed his situation with the clear-eyed pragmatism that had carried him through previous crises. He was alive. That was the first victory. Everything else was negotiable. His inventory was grim but not hopeless. The firewood would last perhaps 3 more days if he was careful. There was no food, his stomach cramped with hunger at the realization. Water meant melting snow, which meant fuel for the fire, which meant the firewood wouldn't last as long as 3 days. He had matches, blankets, and a shelter that kept out the worst of the cold. He had no way to signal for help, no communication, and no clear sense of when or if rescue would come. Harold rebuilt the fire with methodical care, coaxing it back to life with the last of the kindling and some small branches he found in a bucket. As warmth returned to the space, he removed his boots to examine his feet. The sight wasn't encouraging. His toes were mottled white and red, the early signs of frostbite. He massaged them gently, willing circulation back, knowing that further exposure could mean losing them entirely. He thought of Claire, probably frantic by now. She would have expected his call last night. When it didn't come, she would have contacted the transport company, demanded answers. But the company would say they'd dropped him off. Kyle would claim he'd left Harold safe at some location, would cover his mistake out of fear or stupidity. The confusion would buy time that Harold didn't have. From his wallet, Harold pulled out a worn recipe card, folded and refolded so many times that the creases had nearly split. Violet's handwriting, still clear after all these years. My famous winter stew. She'd written it for Claire when their daughter was learning to cook, adding little notes in the margins. Don't rush the browning, and extra love is the secret ingredient. Harold traced the words with his finger, remembering Sunday dinners when the house had filled with the scent of simmering vegetables and Violet's laughter. He remembered Claire standing on a step-stool to reach the counter, her small hands carefully measuring ingredients under her mother's patient guidance. Those moments had seemed so ordinary at the time, just the texture of everyday life. Now they shimmered with the weight of everything he'd lost and everything he still had to lose. I need to see her again, Harold said aloud to the empty room, to Violet's memory, to whatever force governed the universe. I'm not finished yet. A sound outside drew his attention, scratching at the base of the shelter, rhythmic and purposeful. Harold moved to the window and pulled aside the canvas. The world beyond was transformed, buried under 2 feet of fresh snow that gleamed in the morning light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape so pristine it hurt to look at. And there, at the shelter's base, were the wolves. The larger one, Harold had begun thinking of him as Smoke, borrowing from Cassidy's naming convention, was digging at the snow near the ladder's base. The smaller wolf, Shadow in Harold's mind, stood watch nearby, her head turning slowly to scan the tree line. They moved with the coordinated purpose of a team, each understanding their role without apparent communication. Harold watched, transfixed. Smoke wasn't digging randomly, he was clearing a path to what looked like a small storage box buried beneath the snow and debris. After several minutes of effort, the wolf managed to expose the corner of the container. Then both animals retreated to the tree line and sat, watching the shelter. It took Harold 15 minutes to work up the courage to open the door. The cold hit him immediately, but curiosity drove him down the ladder, moving carefully on the icy rungs. The wolves didn't flee, they remained where they were, amber eyes tracking his every movement. The storage box Smoke had uncovered was metal, weathered but sealed. Harold brushed away the remaining snow and found a latch that opened with some effort. Inside were more emergency supplies, waterproof matches, a compass, and most importantly, several sealed packages of freeze-dried camping meals. Food. Not much, but enough to extend his survival time significantly. Harold looked toward the tree line where the wolves sat. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying across the snow. "I don't know how you knew, but thank you." Smoke's ears twitched forward. Shadow stood, took 2 steps closer, then sat again. They were communicating something. Harold was sure of it, though he couldn't have explained what or how. He carried the supplies back to the shelter, his heart lighter despite the cold seeping through his clothes. Once inside with the fire rebuilt, Harold prepared one of the freeze-dried meals, following the instructions to add boiling water and wait. The resulting stew was bland and vaguely unpleasant, nothing like Violet's recipe, but it was warm, and it filled the hollow ache in his stomach. As he ate, Harold returned to Cassidy's logbook, reading more carefully now. The ranger had documented wolf behavior extensively, their hunting patterns, their social structures, the way they communicated through body language and vocalizations. One passage stood out. The 1st of March 1987 observed Ranger and Scout with what appears to be their pack, 5 adults total, moving with remarkable coordination. Scout led them to a fallen elk I'd spotted yesterday, but couldn't reach safely. The pack fed, then Scout howled a specific pattern, 3 long notes followed by 2 short. Within an hour, ravens arrived to scavenge. It was as if she was calling them, ensuring nothing went to waste. Intelligence or instinct? The line blurs with wolves. Harold set down the journal, his mind working through possibilities. These wolves, if they were truly descendants of Cassidy's pair, might carry knowledge passed down through generations. Pack territories often remained stable for decades. Young wolves learned from their elders not just how to hunt, but where to hunt, which areas were safe, which held resources. Could they remember that this shelter meant safety? That humans who smelled of wood smoke and camp food were once kind? The notion seemed impossible. Yet Harold had watched Smoke deliberately uncover food supplies. That wasn't random animal behavior, that was problem-solving, possibly even helping. The alternative explanation that he was assigning meaning to coincidence, anthropomorphizing wild animals because loneliness and fear were breaking down, his rational mind felt equally plausible. Harold had to consider that he might be hallucinating significance into ordinary wolf behavior. Hypothermia could affect cognition. Hunger could create false patterns. But the food was real. The cleared path was real. And when Harold looked out the window again, the wolves were still there, maintaining their vigil. He spent the afternoon in careful rationing, 1 piece of firewood per hour, enough to maintain temperature without waste. He melted snow for water, using a metal cup from the supplies, grateful for small mercies. His body ached with fatigue, but he forced himself to move periodically, to keep his blood flowing, to exercise his frostbitten toes despite the pain. As evening approached, the wolves began to howl. The sound was primal and beautiful, rising from the forest in overlapping harmonies. Harold had heard wolves before, but never this close, never this intentional. The howls weren't directed at each other, they were aimed outward, broadcast across the mountainside. They were announcing presence, marking territory, warning other predators away from this area, warning them away from the shelter. Harold sat by the stove as darkness fell, listening to those ancient voices. He thought about Violet, about Claire, about all the years he'd spent moving through life with careful control, avoiding risks, protecting himself from more loss. And he thought about these wolves, who lived every day with risk, who survived through cooperation and courage and connection to their pack. "I should have been more like you," Harold said to the darkness beyond the window. "Should have held tighter to my pack while I had them." The howling continued into the night, a sound both lonely and defiant, and Harold, wrapped in emergency blankets by a dying fire, felt less alone than he had in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight he had food, warmth, and unlikely guardians keeping watch in the darkness. It would have to be enough. The 4th day brought a clarity that felt almost cruel. Harold woke to brilliant sunlight streaming through the window, the kind of crystalline Montana morning that belonged on postcards. The storm had moved on, leaving behind a world scoured, clean, and beautiful, and utterly indifferent to whether he lived or died. He discovered the compass rose carving when he reached into his coat pocket for the locket. The small wooden piece, no larger than a silver dollar, had been there all along, forgotten. Harold held it up to the light, remembering the day he'd made it for Claire's 10th birthday. He'd spent weeks getting the details right, the cardinal points perfectly aligned, the decorative scrollwork around the edges, the words carved into the back, "Always find your way home." Claire had treasured it throughout her childhood, keeping it on her bedside table through high school and college. Then, the year before Harold moved to Montana, she'd pressed it back into his hand. "Your turn to keep it safe," she'd said, "so you can always find your way back to us." Harold's throat tightened. He'd been so focused on maintaining his independence, on not being a burden, that he'd forgotten the simplest truth: his family wanted him around. not out of obligation, but out of love. And now he might never get the chance to tell Claire that he understood, that he was grateful, that he'd been a fool to hold himself at such careful distance. The firewood was critically low. By Harold's calculation, he had enough for one more day, possibly two, if he let the temperature drop dangerously low between feedings. After that, he'd have to make a choice, burn the wooden furniture in the shelter, or accept that the cold would finish what the storm had started. He chose survival. Using a metal tool from the emergency supplies, Harold dismantled the small chair near the cot. Each crack of breaking wood felt like a small betrayal to Cassidy, to the careful preparation that had gone into this shelter. But he suspected the ranger would understand. Survival required difficult choices, required taking what you needed while leaving what you could for the next person. Harold's body was failing in incremental ways. The frostbite had spread, turning 3 of his toes a worrying shade of grey-black. His thinking felt sluggish, cottony, as if his brain was operating through layers of insulation. Twice that morning he'd caught himself speaking to Violet as if she were sitting across from him, and he couldn't entirely trust that these weren't hallucinations. The line between memory and present was blurring. He'd find himself back in their kitchen, Violet at the stove, Claire doing homework at the table. Then he'd blink and be alone in the shelter, the fire crackling, reality reasserting itself with cold precision. "Stay sharp," Harold told himself firmly. "Confusion kills." He forced himself through exercises, counting backwards from 100, reciting Claire's phone number, naming every president in order. Mental calisthenics to keep his mind from drifting too far into the fog. When he caught himself failing to remember simple things, he'd splash his face with snow-melt water, shocking himself back to alertness. Through the window, Harold watched the wolves. They were closer today, visible in the clearing below the shelter. Smoke and shadow moved with easy confidence in the deep snow, their powerful legs carrying them across drifts that would have trapped Harold instantly. They were hunting, he realized, working in coordination to track something through the trees. Harold grabbed Cassidy's journal and found the section on wolf behavior. The ranger had documented their hunting strategies extensively. February 18, observed pack hunting technique. They move in a pattern, scouts at the flanks, drivers behind, ambush ahead. Each wolf knows their role without apparent signal. When they work together, success rate climbs dramatically. Alone, a wolf struggles. Together, they're nearly unstoppable. There's a lesson there for humans, I suspect. As Harold watched, the pattern unfolded exactly as Cassidy had described. Shadow circled wide to the left, while smoke pressed forward. They were herding something, driving it toward Harold, leaned closer to the window toward a third wolf he hadn't seen before, positioned ahead in ambush. The hunt ended quickly. Harold looked away, respecting the necessity while acknowledging his discomfort. This was nature's economy, life feeding on life, no malice, just survival. The wolves had families to feed, just as he'd once worked 2 jobs to keep Claire clothed and educated. What happened next, though, defied his understanding. After feeding, the wolves didn't leave. Smoke approached the shelter, carrying something in his jaws. He dropped it at the base of the ladder, a portion of meat, sizable and fresh, then retreated to watch. Harold stared in disbelief. Wolves didn't share kills with humans. They were competitors, not collaborators. Yet there it was, an offering left where he could reach it if he dared to venture outside. He sat motionless for 20 minutes, wrestling with the decision. The meat represented protein, energy, another day or 2 of survival, but retrieving it meant exposure to cold that might finish him. His body had so little reserve left. Finally, necessity won. Harold wrapped himself in the blanket and descended the ladder with agonizing slowness. His hands barely gripped the rungs, his legs threatening to give out with each step. The wolves watched from 30 feet away, close enough that Harold could see the individual hairs of their coats, the intelligence in their amber eyes. He picked up the meat, it was still warm, and climbed back up with the last of his strength. By the time he reached the shelter, his vision was graying at the edges, his heart hammering arrhythmically. He collapsed inside, the meat clutched against his chest, certain he'd just used years of life he didn't have to spare. But he had food. Actual, substantial food. Harold's hands shook as he prepared it, cutting away what he could use immediately and storing the rest outside in the snow where it would freeze. He'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know proper handling, to understand the risks of contamination. He cooked the meat thoroughly over the fire, and when he finally ate, the taste was like a shock to his system, rich, gamey, nothing like the bland, freeze-dried meals. Strength returned in small increments. That evening, Harold sat near the window with Cassidy's journal open in his lap. He found a pencil in the supplies and began writing in the margins, adding his own observations to the ranger's decades-old notes. Day 4. The wolves brought me food. I can't explain it, can't rationalize it into ordinary behavior. They're protecting this shelter, protecting me. Smoke is the leader, I'm certain now. Shadow is his mate. There's a third, younger, possibly their offspring. They work with purpose, and I hesitate to write this what seems like intention. Cassidy, if you're reading this somehow, your ranger and scout taught their descendants well. They remember that humans can be kind. I hope I'm worthy of that memory. He looked out at the darkening forest. The wolves had settled near the tree line, barely visible in the fading light. Smoke sat alert, head raised, constantly scanning. Shadow rested beside him, her body relaxed but ready. The younger wolf, Harold, decided to call him Scout in honor of Cassidy's female, prowled the perimeter. They were standing guard. There was no other word for it. Harold clutched the compass, rose carving in his hand, and thought about direction, about finding your way home. He'd spent so many years after Violet's death feeling lost, moving through routines without real purpose. Claire had tried to reach him, but he'd kept himself at arm's length, afraid that loving too deeply meant risking too much pain. These wolves loved deeply. They protected their pack with ferocious dedication. They took risks for each other, shared resources, faced dangers together, and somehow, impossibly, they'd extended that protection to include him. "I don't deserve this," Harold whispered, "but I'm grateful." Outside, Smoke raised his head and howled a long, mournful note that carried across the mountain. Shadow joined him, their voices intertwining. Scout added his younger, less certain howl to the chorus. And Harold, alone in his shelter with a dying fire and dwindling hope, felt his throat close with emotion. He was 80 years old, possibly dying, certainly closer to the end than the beginning. But in this moment, surrounded by the voices of creatures who had chosen to keep him alive, he felt profoundly connected to something larger than himself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. His body was shutting down incrementally, his resources nearly exhausted. But tonight he had warmth and food, and the knowledge that he wasn't truly alone. Sometimes that was enough to keep fighting. Harold's 5th day began with a realization that should have terrified him, but instead brought a strange calm. He was dying. Not might be, not could be, was dying. His body had begun the slow shutdown that hypothermia and starvation triggered, the conservation of resources for core functions at the expense of everything else. His extremities felt distant, disconnected. His thoughts drifted like snow on wind, landing briefly before lifting away again. He lay on the cot, wrapped in every blanket the shelter possessed, and made peace with it. 80 years was a respectable run. He'd loved deeply, raised a good daughter, left some small mark on the world. The manner of his death alone in the mountains seemed almost fitting for someone who'd spent so much of his later life in self-imposed isolation. "I'm sorry, Claire," he whispered to the rafters. "I tried." But even as acceptance settled over him, his body fought on with stubborn independence. His heart kept beating, his lungs kept drawing breath. Some primal part of him refused to surrender, even as his conscious mind drifted toward the peace of letting go. The scratching at the door pulled him back, Not the base of the shelter this time, but the door itself, insistent, rhythmic. Harold forced his eyes open. Through the window, he could see nothing but grey dawn light. The scratching continued, urgent now. With tremendous effort, Harold rolled off the cot and crawled to the door. His legs wouldn't support him anymore. He pulled himself across the floor, each movement an argument with gravity and exhaustion. When he reached the door, he pushed it open a few inches and looked down. A metal box sat on the small landing outside, different from the one Smoke had uncovered days ago. This one was newer, painted Ranger Service green with a weather-tight seal, and it was positioned precisely where Harold could reach it without descending the ladder. The wolves had brought it. Harold pulled the box inside and opened it with shaking hands. Inside were emergency supplies clearly meant for human use, chemical heat packs, energy bars, a foil emergency blanket, and most precious of all, a flare gun with 3 flares. He stared at the contents, his foggy mind struggling to process the impossibility. Wolves didn't understand human tools. They couldn't comprehend flare guns or their purpose. Yet somehow they'd found this box probably from another old storage cache in the area and positioned it where he could find it. The alternative explanation was that Harold's mind had finally broken, that he was hallucinating rescue while his body slowly froze. But the box was solid and real beneath his hands. The flare gun was cold, metal and plastic, undeniably present. Harold activated a heat pack and pressed it against his chest, feeling warmth spread through his core. He ate one of the energy bars, the concentrated nutrients hitting his system like electricity. His mind cleared slightly, enough to make decisions. To plan. The flare gun represented hope. If he could get outside, if he could fire a flare high enough and the weather held clear, someone might see it. Search and rescue teams, rangers, maybe even satellite monitoring. The odds were long, but they were better than waiting here for the end. But firing the flare meant going outside, and Harold wasn't certain he could make it down the ladder anymore. His body had so little left to give. If he fell, if he used his remaining strength on the attempt and failed, he'd die in the snow instead of in the shelter. There'd be no coming back. He thought about Violet's locket, about the compass rose, about all the promises he'd made and broken through fear and distance. He thought about Caleb, growing up without his grandfather's stories. About Claire, finding out her father had died alone and cold because a transport driver made a stupid mistake. The decision crystallized. Harold would try. He'd crawl if he had to, fire the flare even if it killed him, because the alternative was accepting defeat without exhausting every possibility. Violet hadn't raised a quitter. Neither had his own parents, farmers who'd survived the Depression through sheer stubborn refusal to lie down. "All right," Harold said aloud, his voice rough and thin. "One more time." He prepared methodically, moving slowly to conserve energy. He put on every layer he possessed, wrapped himself in the foil blanket, tucked the flare gun into his coat. In his breast pocket, he placed 2 items, Violet's locket and a note written on the back of the transport receipt. "To Claire I fought. I love you. Tell Caleb his grandpa thought about him at the end. Find joy in every day. Life is shorter than we think. Dad." The descent was agony. Harold's hands slipped on the icy rungs, his legs buckled and caught, buckled and caught. Halfway down he stopped, clinging to the ladder, certain he couldn't continue, his vision tunneled. His heart stuttered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Then Smoke appeared below, standing directly beneath the ladder. The wolf's presence was steady, grounding. Harold met those amber eyes and saw something he couldn't name, recognition perhaps, or encouragement, or simply the reflection of his own desperate will to survive. "I'm coming," Harold told the wolf. "Just give me a minute." He continued down. When his feet finally touched the ground, his legs gave out immediately. Harold collapsed into snow that had drifted against the shelter, the cold shocking against his face. He tried to rise, couldn't, settled for pulling himself along on his stomach like a wounded animal. Shadow appeared on his left, smoke on his right. They pressed against him, providing warmth and stability, their bodies forming a living barrier against the wind. Harold got his knees under him, then one foot, then the other. He stood barely, swaying, held upright more by will than strength. The clearing where he'd first seen the shelter stretched before him. Harold stumbled toward it, the wolves pacing beside him, their presence keeping him upright through sheer force of example. If they could survive out here day after day, then he could survive long enough to fire one flare. 30 yards from the shelter, 40, 50. Harold stopped, his chest heaving, and looked up at the sky. Clear, brilliant, perfect visibility for miles. He pulled out the flare gun with fingers that barely functioned, fumbled with the safety, aimed toward the vast emptiness of the valley below. "Please," he whispered. "Violet, Claire, whoever's listening, please." He pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. His frozen finger hadn't applied enough pressure. Harold tried again, squeezing with everything he had. The flare ignited with a whoosh that startled him backward. Brilliant red light arced into the sky, trailing smoke, climbing higher and higher until it hung suspended at its apex before beginning its slow descent. Harold watched it fall, watched it burn, watched hope manifest as fire against the morning sky. Then his legs gave out for the final time. He dropped to his knees in the snow, then forward onto his hands, then down entirely. The cold embraced him, not cruel, just indifferent, the ancient cold of mountains that had existed long before humans and would remain long after. Harold's consciousness began to fade, pulling away from his body like water draining from a tub. He felt the wolves before he saw them. Smoke pressed against his back, massive and warm. Shadow lay against his side. Scout positioned himself at Harold's feet. They weren't leaving. Even as he lay dying in the snow, they maintained their vigil, providing what warmth they could, refusing to abandon their charge. Harold's last clear thought was gratitude. Not for rescue, he was beyond that now, but for this final gift of companionship, for not dying alone. The wolves had given him that. They'd kept their watch to the end. His eyes closed, his breathing slowed. The world contracted to the warmth of wolves and the distant sound of rotors. Or was that just his failing mind, creating comfort where none existed? The sound grew louder, definitely rotors, definitely real. Harold tried to open his eyes, couldn't manage it. Tried to move, felt the wolves shift position. Tried to understand what was happening as voices called out, as hands reached for him, as someone said, "We've got him. He's alive. Barely, but he's alive." The wolves didn't flee. Harold felt them there, steadfast, until human hands lifted him onto a stretcher. Only then did they retreat, and even their retreat was measured, reluctant, as if releasing him to his own kind required a conscious choice. Someone wrapped him in heated blankets, someone else started an IV. The helicopter lifted with a lurch that Harold felt distantly, his body reporting sensations his mind couldn't quite process. "Sir, can you hear me?" A woman's voice, professional and calm. "Sir, you're safe now. We're taking you to Whitefish Medical. You're going to be okay." Harold managed the smallest nod. Okay. The word felt foreign, impossible, miraculous. As consciousness left him for real this time, his last thought was of amber eyes, watching from the tree line, of ancient intelligence and impossible kindness, of wolves who'd rewritten everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between species. They'd saved him, not through chance or coincidence, but through deliberate, sustained effort, and Harold would spend whatever life remained to him trying to understand why. Harold woke to the steady beep of monitors and the antiseptic smell of hospitals. For a moment he thought he'd dreamed everything, the blizzard, the shelter, the wolves. Then pain reasserted itself in waves, his body cataloguing damage with clinical precision. His toes throbbed, his chest ached with each breath. His hip felt like someone had driven nails through the joint, but he was warm and alive. "Dad!" Claire's voice, thick with tears, her hand closed around his, careful of the IV line. "Dad, can you hear me?" Harold's eyes focused slowly. Claire sat beside the bed, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. Behind her, Caleb stood pressed against his mother's side, his eyes wide and scared. "Hey, sunshine," Harold managed, his voice barely a whisper. The old nickname for Claire, unused in years. She broke then, lowering her head to his hand, her shoulders shaking. "I thought when they said you were missing, when they couldn't find you, I'm okay." Harold squeezed her hand weakly. "Takes more than a blizzard." A doctor entered. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and greying hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Mr. Greyson, I'm Dr. Cynthia Zhao. Welcome back. You gave us quite a scare." Over the next hour, Harold learned the extent of his damage. Severe frostbite on both feet. They'd managed to save most of his toes, but 2 on his left foot required amputation. Dehydration, malnutrition, hypothermia, and a dangerously irregular heartbeat that would require monitoring. By all medical logic, he shouldn't have survived 5 days in those conditions. "Frankly, it's miraculous," Dr. Zhao said. "Another 12 hours and we'd be having a very different conversation." Sheriff Talbot arrived that afternoon, taking Harold's statement with patient attention. Harold recounted everything: Kyle's wrong turn, the abandoned van, his trek to the shelter, the wolves. When he mentioned the wolves, Talbot's expression shifted to professional skepticism. "Mr. Greyson, you were in extreme conditions. Hypothermia can cause hallucinations, confusion." "I know what I saw," Harold interrupted firmly. "The wolves were real. They brought me food. They brought me the flare gun. They kept me warm at the end." Talbot exchanged a glance with Claire. "We'll document everything in the report. The important thing is you're safe now." But Harold could see the disbelief in their faces. They thought he'd imagined it, that desperation and cold had conjured protective wolves from ordinary animal behavior. Only Caleb seemed to accept the story without question, his young imagination untainted by adult skepticism. The media discovered the story within hours. 8 0-year-old survives, 5 days in blizzard, became elderly man, claims wolves saved his life. Became a sensation that spread across news cycles, hungry for feel-good content. Claire fielded interview requests with fierce protectiveness, refusing all of them. But the story spread anyway. Social media picked it up, wildlife experts weighed in, some called it a miracle, others called it delusion. The debate raged while Harold lay in his hospital bed, frustrated by the attention and his inability to make people understand. On the 3rd day, a woman named Priscilla Yates visited. She introduced herself as the manager of a conservation monitoring station in the area and asked Harold to recount his experience in detail. Unlike the others, she listened without interruption, taking notes on a tablet. "Mr. Greyson," she said when he finished, "I'd like to show you something." She pulled up footage on her tablet, grainy black and white video from a remote camera. The timestamp showed the day Harold went missing. The footage showed a figure stumbling through snow, heading toward higher ground. Harold recognized himself, barely. "We have cameras throughout the region," Priscilla explained. "Wildlife monitoring mostly. This one caught you heading toward the old ranger station." She advanced the footage. Hours later, 2 shapes appeared in frame, moving in the same direction Harold had gone. Wolves, unmistakably. Then more footage from different cameras, time stamped across the 5 days. Wolves near the shelter. Wolves pacing a perimeter. Wolves sitting sentinel in the snow. "This is unusual," Priscilla said carefully. "Not unprecedented, but unusual. There are documented cases of wolves exhibiting protective behavior toward other species. Biologists theorize it might be related to pack bonding mechanisms or generalized caregiving behaviors. But I've never seen it sustained over multiple days like this." Harold felt vindication surge through him. So you believe me? I believe the footage, and I believe something remarkable happened on that mountain. She zoomed in on one of the wolves. This is the alpha male. We've been tracking this pack for 3 years. The female is his mate. They have 3 juveniles, though only one was with them during your ordeal. She pulled up another file, this one containing old documents. I did some research after hearing your story. In 1986, a ranger named Cassidy ran a small wolf rehabilitation program out of that same station. 2 wolves, injured, nursed back to health and released. Harold sat up straighter despite the pain. I found his journal. He wrote about them, Ranger and Scout. Priscilla's eyes widened. You found Cassidy's journal? Do you remember what it said? Harold recounted what he could remember. The entries about the wolves' recovery, their bond with the ranger, their eventual release. Priscilla was already typing rapidly on her tablet. Mr. Greyson, we took blood samples from the den area last spring for a genetic study. If we could compare that DNA to the original wolves Cassidy worked with, we kept samples from the rehabilitation program, we might be able to establish a direct lineage. You think these are their descendants? I think it's possible. Wolf packs maintain territories for generations. Knowledge passes from parents to offspring, where to hunt, where to den, and yes, potentially, where safety exists. If these wolves are descended from Ranger and Scout, they might carry a generational memory of that shelter as a place of safety, possibly even of positive human interaction. The implications settled over Harold like weight. These weren't random wolves who'd stumbled upon him. They were the continuation of a relationship that Cassidy had started 37 years ago, a kindness that had echoed across generations. There's something else, Priscilla said quietly. She pulled up footage from the morning of Harold's rescue. It showed him collapsed in the snow with 3 wolves pressed against him. Then the helicopter arriving, setting down in the clearing. The wolves, retreating but not fleeing, maintaining their position at the tree line. The footage showed the rescue team approaching Harold, loading him onto a stretcher, and throughout it all, the wolves watched. When the helicopter lifted off, the largest wolf, Smoke, stood on his hind legs briefly, as if trying to track where Harold was being taken. They didn't want to leave you, Priscilla said softly. Even when the helicopter created chaos, even when their instinct surely said to run, they stayed until they knew you were with your own kind. Harold's vision blurred with tears. He'd thought he understood what happened on that mountain, but seeing it documented, verified by someone who studied these animals professionally, made it real in a way nothing else had. Claire, who'd been listening silently, spoke up. What happens to them now, the wolves? They're protected, Priscilla assured her. This pack's territory is within conservation land, but there's been some pressure to capture them for study. Some scientists want to understand the behavior, run tests, keep them in controlled environments. No, Harold said firmly. Absolutely not. I agree, Priscilla said. That's actually why I'm here. I want your permission to go public with this footage, to tell the real story. Not the sensationalized version, but the scientific reality that we witnessed, remarkable behavior that deserves protection and respect, not exploitation. Harold looked at Claire, who nodded. Do it, he said. But make sure people understand these wolves need to stay wild. That's where they belong. That's where they saved me. Priscilla smiled. I'll make sure that message is crystal clear. After she left, Harold lay back against his pillows, exhausted but vindicated. The wolves were real. Their behavior was documented. And somewhere in the mountains, Smoke and Shadow and Scout were living their lives, unaware that they'd become part of something larger than survival. Caleb climbed onto the bed carefully, snuggling against Harold's good side. Grandpa, do you think the wolves miss you? Harold thought about Amber Eyes, watching as the helicopter lifted away. About 5 days of protection given freely to a stranger, about the ancient bond between species that defied easy explanation. I think they know I'm okay, he told his grandson, and I think I'll miss them for the rest of my life." The footage went viral within 24 hours. Priscilla's careful documentation, combined with Harold's survival story, captured something the world desperately needed: proof that kindness echoed across generations, that the bonds between species ran deeper than anyone had imagined. The video of Harold collapsed in the snow, with 3 wolves pressed against him, became an image shared millions of times, each viewer finding their own meaning in the ancient tableau. But attention brought complications. Harold's hospital room became a fortress against reporters, camera crews, and wildlife advocates of every stripe. Some wanted to study the wolves. Others wanted to relocate them to sanctuaries. A few extreme voices called for their removal entirely, citing danger to hikers and residents. The noise was overwhelming, the opinions endless, and Harold found himself at the center of a debate he'd never asked to join. "I just want them left alone," he told Claire for the 10th time that week. "They saved my life by being what they are, wild, free, trying to cage that would dishonor everything they did." Claire squeezed his hand. "Then we'll make sure that message gets heard." Sheriff Talbot's investigation into the transport company revealed a pattern of negligence. Kyle had been the 3rd driver in 2 years to make dangerous mistakes. The company faced lawsuits, regulatory action, and public censure. Kyle himself had been fired and was facing criminal charges for reckless endangerment. Harold refused to press charges personally. "The boy made a terrible mistake," Harold told Talbot. "Punish the company, fix the system, but destroying one young man's life won't change what happened to me." The sheriff shook his head in amazement. "You're more forgiving than most people would be." "I've learned something about second chances lately," Harold replied, thinking of wolves who'd been taught kindness and passed it forward. Physical therapy began in the 2nd week. Harold's body had been ravaged by the ordeal. His balance was compromised by the missing toes, his cardiovascular system weakened, his joints protesting every movement. The therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Arlene, pushed him through exercises that left him sweating and shaking. "You want to walk again?" she asked during a particularly difficult session. "Then you do the work." Harold gritted his teeth and did the work. Not just for himself, but because he'd decided something during those long nights in the shelter. If he survived, and he had, then survival needed to mean something. He needed to live, really live, not just exist in the careful bubble he'd constructed after Violet's death. The genetic testing results came back in week 3. Priscilla brought them personally, her face bright with professional excitement. "It's confirmed," she announced. "The alpha pair shares DNA markers with Cassidy's original wolves. They're direct descendants, maybe 3rd or 4th generation. This is the first documented case of generational behavioral transmission in wild wolves related to human interaction." Harold felt something settle in his chest: validation, wonder, and a deep sense of connection to Cassidy across the decades. That ranger's act of kindness in 1986 had literally saved Harold's life in 2024. The ripples of compassion traveled further than anyone imagined. "We're publishing the findings," Priscilla continued. "This will change how we understand wolf behavior, pack dynamics, learned versus instinctive actions. You're part of scientific history, Harold." "I'm just grateful," Harold said simply. "What happens to the pack now?" "They're safe. The Conservation Board voted unanimously for enhanced protection of their territory. No human intervention, no capture attempts, just monitoring from a respectful distance. We'd like to invite you to the observation station in the spring, once you're recovered. The pack regularly passes near there. You could see them again, under controlled circumstances." Harold's heart seized at the possibility. From a safe distance, yes, and Harold, they'd know you were there. Wolves have excellent memory for scents and individuals. They'd recognize you. The idea took root immediately. Harold committed to his physical therapy with renewed intensity, driven by the thought of returning to those mountains, of seeing smoke and shadow and scout again, not to capture them or study them, but simply to witness them living the lives they'd fought to preserve. Claire watched her father's transformation with wonder. The distant, careful man she'd worried about for years was becoming someone else, engaged, purposeful, looking forward instead of constantly backward. They talked more in those weeks than they had in the previous 5 years. Conversations that ranged from memories of Violet to plans for the future, to honest discussions about fear and loss, and the courage required to keep loving when love inevitably meant pain. "I pushed you away," Harold admitted one evening, Caleb asleep on the chair beside his bed. "After your mother died, I was so afraid of losing anyone else that I kept everyone at arm's length. Even you. Especially you." Claire's eyes glistened. "I understood, Dad, or I tried to. But you shouldn't have had to. You lost your mother too, and instead of holding you closer, His voice broke. "I'm sorry, Claire, for all the years I wasted being scared." She moved to embrace him carefully, mindful of his injuries. "You're here now. That's what matters." 2 months after his rescue, Harold was released from the hospital. Claire had arranged temporary housing in Seattle so he could continue therapy and be near family. Harold agreed, surprising himself with how much he craved the proximity, the noise of Caleb playing, the comfort of Claire's presence. The house in Pine Ridge would wait. For now, he needed his pack. The media attention had faded somewhat, replaced by newer stories, but Harold's tale had left its mark. Conservation funding increased dramatically. Schools taught the story as a lesson in ecology and empathy. Harold received thousands of letters from people inspired by his survival, by the wolves' protection, by the message that nature and humanity could coexist with mutual respect. One letter particularly moved him. It came from a conservation biologist at a university, discussing plans to establish a program studying generational learning in wolf populations. The program would be named the Cassidy Initiative, honoring the ranger whose acts of kindness had started everything. They asked Harold's permission to include his story in their founding materials. Harold agreed immediately. Cassidy deserved recognition, deserved to know wherever he was that his legacy lived on in more than just wolves. George Kimball called regularly from Pine Ridge, updating Harold on the house and sharing town gossip. Francis sent care packages from the diner, cookies and preserves, and notes written on recipe cards. The small community that had been Harold's refuge for 15 years reminded him that he had more than one pack, more than one place to call home. But the mountains called to him. Harold dreamed of pine forests and snow, of amber eyes watching from shadows, of the ancient language of howls echoing across ridges. His body healed incrementally. He learned to walk with a slight limp, to manage the phantom pain where his toes had been, to work around limitations that age and trauma had imposed. By early spring, Dr. Zhao cleared him for limited travel. "Nothing strenuous," she warned. "You're 80 years old and you've been through hell. Don't push it." "I won't," Harold promised, already planning his return to Montana. Priscilla arranged everything: the trip to the observation station, the safety protocols, the timing coordinated with the pack's known patterns. Claire insisted on coming, bringing Caleb for what she called educational purposes, but Harold suspected was worry disguised as adventure. The night before they left Seattle, Harold sat on Claire's porch watching the sunset. He held the compass rose carving in one hand and Violet's locket in the other, talismans that had carried him through the worst and now accompanied him towards something better. "I'm going to see them again," he told Violet's photograph later in the privacy of the guest room. "The wolves who saved me. I don't know what I'll say or do, but I need to acknowledge it somehow, to say thank you properly." He slept better that night than he had in months, dreaming of mountains and the wild things that called them home. The conservation station sat nestled in a valley 3 miles from the ranger shelter where Harold had nearly died. The building was modern. equipped with sophisticated monitoring equipment and observation platforms designed to minimize human impact on wildlife. Priscilla greeted them at the entrance, her professional excitement tempered by genuine warmth. "Welcome back to the mountains, Harold," she said, shaking his hand carefully. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm home," Harold replied, and meant it. The pine-scented air, the massive peaks rising in every direction, even the lingering patches of snow in shadowed areas, all of it sang to something deep in his chest. Claire kept close, one hand on Caleb's shoulder, her protective instincts heightened by the memory of how close she'd come to losing her father. But Caleb was vibrating with excitement, pressing his face to every window, asking endless questions about wildlife and tracking and how wolves communicated. "Your grandson has a naturalist's curiosity," Priscilla observed, smiling. "He gets it from his great-grandmother," Harold said. "Violet could identify every bird, every plant. She taught me to pay attention to the world around me." Inside, Priscilla showed them the monitoring setup screens, displaying feeds from dozens of cameras scattered across the wolf pack's territory. A detailed map showed movement patterns, den locations, hunting grounds, the pack's life laid out in data points and probability curves. "They're active now," Priscilla said, pointing to a screen showing thermal signatures moving through a valley. 5 individuals, the alpha pair, their 3 offspring from last spring. They're heading this direction, following their usual patrol route. Harold's heart accelerated. After months of recovery, of physical therapy and emotional reckoning, he was about to see them again. The wolves who'd saved him, who'd demonstrated that the boundaries between species were more permeable than anyone believed. "We'll go to the blind," Priscilla explained. "It's a one-way observation post about 200 yards from their regular path. They can't see in, but you'll have a clear view. We absolutely cannot approach them or try to interact. These are wild animals, and maintaining that boundary is essential for their safety and ours." Harold understood. This wasn't about reclaiming some imagined friendship with wolves. It was about witnessing them living free, about closing a circle that had opened during the worst days of his life. The blind was a sophisticated structure built into the hillside, virtually invisible from outside. Inside, large windows provided sweeping views of a meadow, where Priscilla explained the pack often paused during their territory rounds. The glass was treated to be one way, ensuring the wolves would see only their own reflection. They settled in to wait. Caleb pressed against the window, binoculars clutched in small hands. Claire sat beside Harold, her hand finding his, and Harold simply breathed, feeling the weight of anticipation and gratitude in equal measure. "There," Priscilla whispered after 20 minutes. At the tree line, 11 o'clock. Harold saw them first as shadows, then as distinct shapes emerging into the meadow. 3 younger wolves bounded ahead with the careless energy of adolescence, playing and wrestling, their movements full of joy and vitality. Behind them, moving with the measured confidence of leaders, came Smoke and Shadow. Harold's breath caught. They were magnificent, powerful and graceful, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sun. Smoke's distinctive grey-black pattern was unmistakable, as was Shadow's lighter colouring and smaller frame. They moved as a unit, the younger wolves responding to subtle cues from their parents, learning the ancient choreography of pack life. "That's them," Harold whispered. "That's Smoke and Shadow." Priscilla nodded. "The genetic testing confirmed it. These are the wolves that stayed with you." The pack moved through the meadow, investigating scents, marking territory, engaging in the complex social interactions that defined their daily existence. One of the juveniles, Harold decided it was Scout, though he couldn't be certain, practiced stalking techniques on his siblings, crouching and pouncing in moves that would someday mean survival. Smoke paused suddenly, his head turning toward the blind. Harold froze, certain the wolf couldn't see him but feeling exposed nonetheless. Smoke's nostrils flared, testing the air. His posture shifted, not aggressive, but alert, focused. "He knows," Harold said softly. "Somehow, He knows I'm here. It's possible, Priscilla agreed quietly. Wolves have extraordinary scent detection. The wind's coming from our direction. He might recognize your scent from months ago. Shadow joined her mate, both wolves now oriented toward the blind. The juveniles, sensing their parents' attention shift, stopped playing and watched. For a long moment, the 5 wolves stood motionless, a tableau of wild intelligence focused on the invisible humans observing them. Then Smoke took 3 deliberate steps toward the blind. Shadow matched him. They stopped perhaps 100 yards away, close enough that Harold could see the individual hairs of their coats, the amber intensity of their eyes, the controlled power in their stance. Harold stood slowly, moving to the very edge of the window. His reflection would be visible to the wolves now, a human shape behind glass. He raised his hand, not waving, just acknowledging, bearing witness to this moment of recognition across the boundary between worlds. Smoke's head tilted slightly. His ears rotated forward, and then, in a gesture that made Harold's throat close with emotion, the wolf dipped his head, once a slow, deliberate movement that might have been acknowledgement or might have been coincidence, but felt like understanding. "Did you see that?" Caleb breathed. "Grandpa," he nodded at you. "I saw it," Harold whispered. Shadow added her own gesture, sitting back on her haunches, a posture that in wolf language signaled calm, non-aggression, peaceful intent. The juveniles mimicked their mother, all 3 sitting in a row, watching the blind with curious but unafraid attention. They stayed that way for perhaps 2 minutes, wolves and humans regarding each other across the space that separated them. Harold felt tears tracking down his face, but made no move to wipe them away. This was the moment he'd needed, not to recapture something lost, but to affirm something found. The wolves were thriving, living as they should, carrying forward the legacy of kindness that Cassidy had planted decades ago. Finally, Smoke stood. He turned away from the blind, Shadow following, the juveniles scrambling to their feet. The pack moved on, continuing their patrol, dissolving back into the forest as if they'd never been anything more than dreams. But Harold knew better. They were real. The connection was real. And it would remain real for whatever time he had left, a reminder that the world contained more mystery and grace than cynicism could ever encompass. "Thank you," Harold said quietly, unsure if he was speaking to the wolves, to Cassidy, to Violet, or to the universe itself. It didn't matter. Gratitude needed no specific destination. The drive back to Pine Ridge felt different than any journey Harold had taken before. Claire drove, while Caleb dozed in the back seat, exhausted from excitement. Harold watched the mountains fade in the side mirror, feeling something he couldn't quite name, not closure, exactly, but completion. A chapter finished, even as new ones waited to be written. "You're quiet," Claire observed. "Just thinking," Harold turned from the window to his daughter, "about how much time I wasted. Dad, no, let me say this." Harold took a breath. "After your mother died, I convinced myself that keeping distance meant keeping safe. That if I didn't love too hard, didn't connect too deeply, I wouldn't hurt as much when the inevitable losses came. But those wolves taught me something I should have learned from Violet years ago." He paused, finding the words. "They didn't protect me because it was safe. They put themselves at risk, staying near a strange human, defending territory during a blizzard, bringing food that their pack needed. They did it anyway, because that's what pack means. What family means. And I've been so busy protecting myself from pain that I forgot how to be part of a pack." Claire's eyes glistened. "You're part of ours. You always have been. I know that now. I just wish I hadn't needed to almost die to understand it." They spent 3 days in Pine Ridge, Harold reacquainting himself with the town and the home he'd left months ago. George had maintained the property beautifully, the grass trimmed, the mail sorted, the woodshop dusted and organized. Francis threw an impromptu celebration at the diner that drew what seemed like the entire town, everyone wanting to hear the story firsthand. Harold told it, over and over, watching faces light with wonder. He emphasized the scientific aspects, the genetic link, the generational behavior, the conservation implications. But he also spoke from the heart about connection and kindness, and how the world was more mysterious and beautiful than fear allowed us to see. On the second evening, Harold carved a small wooden wolf in his shop, his hands remembering the familiar movements despite months away. The piece took shape slowly, ears alert, head raised, posture proud. When he finished, he called Caleb into the shop. "This is for you," Harold said, placing the carving in his grandson's hands. "To remember what we saw and what it means." Caleb turned the wolf carefully, examining every detail. "It's beautiful, Grandpa. It's a reminder that we share this world with creatures that have their own wisdom, their own ways of caring for each other, and that when we show kindness, it echoes forward in ways we can't predict." Harold crouched to Caleb's level, his knees protesting but his heart steady. "Your great-grandmother taught me to pay attention to nature. I'm teaching you the same thing, and someday you'll teach someone else. My kids, your kids, or anyone who needs to hear it. That's how knowledge survives. We pass it forward, generation to generation, just like those wolves did." Caleb hugged the carving to his chest. "I'll keep it forever, and I'll tell everyone about smoke and shadow." That night, alone in his bedroom, Harold wrote in the journal he'd started during recovery. The pages were filling with observations, memories, thoughts about mortality and meaning, and the strange path that had brought him from despair to gratitude. He'd taken up Cassidy's practice of documentation, adding his own chapter to a story that stretched back decades. May 15 saw the pack today. They're thriving, magnificent, exactly as they should be. Smoke recognized me. I'm certain of it. There was a moment of acknowledgement that transcended species, transcended language. I felt Violet in that moment too, and Cassidy, and everyone who ever chose kindness over fear. The circle is complete, but the ripples continue. A knock interrupted his writing. Claire stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of tea. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Too much to think about." Harold accepted the tea gratefully. "I've been considering something." "What's that?" "Priscilla mentioned they're looking for volunteers, people to help with education programs, about the wolves, about conservation. I'm thinking I might do it. Give talks at schools, community centers, help people understand what I learned." Claire smiled. "Mom would love that. She always said you had a teacher's heart, you just needed the right subject. I found it. Took 80 years and a near-death experience, but I found it." Harold sipped his tea. "I'm also thinking I'd like you and Caleb to visit more often. Not because I need help, I'm managing fine, but because I want the time with you, however much time there is." "We'd like that too." Claire settled into the chair beside his bed. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Anything. Are you afraid of what comes next, whenever that is?" Harold considered the question seriously. "I was. For years after your mother died, I was terrified of the end, but something changed out there in that shelter. I made peace with dying, really made peace with it. And then the wolves gave me more time, more chances. Now, I'm not afraid of dying, I'm afraid of wasting whatever life I have left." He set down his tea and took Claire's hand. "So no, I'm not afraid. I'm grateful. Every morning I wake up is a gift those wolves gave me. I plan to honor that by actually living, not just existing." They sat in comfortable silence, father and daughter, while the Montana night settled around them. Somewhere in the mountains, a wolf pack moved through darkness, teaching their young, protecting their territory, living the ancient patterns that had sustained their kind for millennia. And in a small house in Pine Ridge, an 80-year-old man who'd been given a second chance at life made a promise to himself to be worthy of the gift, to pass forward the kindness he'd received, to live with the fierce commitment to pack that the wolves had demonstrated. The next morning, Harold called Priscilla and accepted her offer. He would tell his story, but more importantly, he would tell the wolves' story. He would be a voice for wildness and wonder, for the preservation of mystery in an age that sought to explain everything. It was a purpose, a calling, a way to transform survival into meaning. And it felt exactly right. 6 months had passed since Harold Greyson returned from the mountains, and the rhythm of his days had transformed into something he'd never anticipated. At 80 years old, a life full of purpose and connection. The photograph hung in his living room now, professionally framed and impossible to ignore. The image, captured from Priscilla's conservation cameras, showed Harold collapsed in the snow, with Smoke, Shadow and Scout pressed against him, providing warmth in his darkest moment. Visitors always stopped to stare at it, drawn by the raw vulnerability and unlikely protection it depicted. Harold used it as a teaching tool. He'd given 43 talks in the past 6 months at schools, community centers, conservation groups, even a TEDx event that Claire had insisted he'd do despite his protests. Each time, he'd stand before the photograph and tell the story, but not as a miracle or a fairy tale. He told it as a lesson in coexistence, in respecting wildness, in understanding that humans weren't separate from nature but part of its intricate web. "Those wolves didn't save me because I was special," he'd say, his voice carrying the calm authority of lived experience. "They saved me because their ancestors learned, generations ago, that humans could be kind. And they remembered. That's the real miracle, not that wolves can be compassionate, but that kindness echoes forward through time if we let it." The talks had impact. Conservation funding in Montana increased by 40%. The Cassidy Initiative received grants to study generational learning in wolf populations across North America. School curricula incorporated lessons about human-wildlife coexistence. Harold's story became a catalyst for change he'd never imagined possible. But the greatest changes were personal. Claire visited monthly now, sometimes for long weekends, sometimes for a full week. Philip had negotiated remote work arrangements, and Caleb had declared Pine Ridge the best place ever after learning to fish with his grandfather in the nearby streams. The careful distance Harold had maintained for years had collapsed into something warm and necessary, actual family life, messy and loud, and full of the connection he'd denied himself for too long. George Kimball joined Harold for coffee every Tuesday at Francis's diner, their conversations ranging from weather to philosophy to the small dramas of small-town life. Francis had started calling Harold the Wolf Whisperer, teasing him gently but with obvious pride that their town had produced such a remarkable story. Harold's health remained stable. He walked with a limp from the missing toes, and his stamina wasn't what it had been, but Dr. Zhao pronounced him surprisingly robust for someone who should have died last November. He took the compliment with grace and continued his daily walks, always toward the tree line, always with Violet's locket in his pocket. The journal he'd started had grown into something substantial, not quite a memoir, but a collection of observations, memories, and lessons learned. He wrote about Violet and their early years together, about raising Claire alone and the mistakes he'd made, about the blizzard and the wolves and the peculiar grace of being saved by creatures he'd thought he understood but had barely begun to comprehend. One evening in early autumn, a young man knocked on Harold's door. He was thin, nervous, his hands shaking slightly as he stood on the porch. Harold recognized him after a moment older now, worn by consequences, but unmistakable. "Kyle." "Mr. Greyson," the young man said, his voice barely steady. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I needed to tell you I'm sorry. Every single day, I think about what I did to you." Harold studied him, the genuine remorse, the weight of guilt carried for months, the courage it took to stand here, facing the man he'd nearly killed through carelessness. "Come in," Harold said quietly. "Sit down." They talked for over an hour. Kyle's life had unraveled after the incident. The job loss was just the beginning. He'd struggled with depression, with the knowledge that his mistake had nearly cost a life. He'd been working at a homeless shelter now, trying to make amends through service, trying to become someone better than the careless kid who'd followed a GPS without thinking. Harold listened to all of it, then poured them both tea and spoke with the wisdom that nearly dying had given him. "What happened to me could have killed me," Harold said. "Should have killed me, by all rights. But it didn't. And you know what? That experience gave me something I'd lost: perspective, connection, purpose. I'm not saying your mistake was good, Kyle, but I'm saying that beating yourself bloody with guilt doesn't help anyone." He leaned forward, meeting the young man's eyes. "You want to make amends? Really make amends? Then live better. Learn from this. Help others. Make sure no one else gets hurt by the kind of carelessness that hurt me. That's the only payment I want you, becoming someone who prevents harm instead of causing it." Kyle's face crumpled, years of held tension releasing. "I don't know how to forgive myself." "Then let me help," Harold said gently. "I forgive you, Kyle. Completely. Now you have to do the harder work, forgiving yourself and becoming the person you want to be." After Kyle left lighter, Harold could see it in his posture. Harold sat on his porch watching the sun set over the mountains. He thought about circles and cycles, about how pain transformed into growth if you let it, about the strange mathematics of grace. His phone buzzed, a text from Caleb with a photo, the carved wolf totem on his nightstand, positioned next to a school project about animal behavior. "Good night, Grandpa. Love you. See you next weekend." Harold smiled, texted back, "Love you too. Dream of wild things." He set the phone down and opened Violet's locket, studying her face in the fading light. "I'm living now," he told her photograph. "Really living. Took me long enough, but I got there." A sound carried down from the mountains, distant but clear in the evening air. Howling. The wolves announcing themselves to the night, marking territory, communicating in their ancient language. Harold couldn't be certain it was Smoke's pack, but he chose to believe it was. They were out there, living wild and free, raising their young, passing forward the knowledge their ancestors had gained. And Harold was here, doing the same in his own way, teaching, connecting, loving without the fear that had constrained him for so long. The howling continued, beautiful and lonely and fierce. Harold closed his eyes and listened, feeling the connection that transcended species and circumstance. He'd been given a second chance by creatures who'd been given a second chance generations before. The circle was complete, but the ripples continued outward, touching lives he'd never meet, influencing futures he'd never see. It was enough. More than enough. Harold Greyson, at 80 years old, had finally learned what Violet had tried to teach him, what the wolves had demonstrated through their protection, what life had been offering all along. That connection was worth the risk, that kindness echoed forward, that every moment mattered if you chose to live it fully. The sun disappeared behind the peaks. The stars emerged, brilliant in Montana's clear sky, and Harold sat in the gathering darkness, grateful for every breath, every heartbeat, every remaining day of this improbable, precious life. Somewhere in those mountains, wolves were living their truth. And here, in this small house in Pine Ridge, so was he.